Hello everybody, today it is the 26th of October. Today we're going to be doing a frontline update looking at the situations in the Kherson, Orikhiv sector, Pryyutne, and Avdiivka sectors. So let's begin with the Kherson front, where we're going to look at the movement of Ukrainian units. We're seeing the movement of the certain elements of the 35th, 36th, and 38th Marine Brigades, these units that I have marked on my map over here. Additional elements from these units are being moved across the Dnieper River onto multiple different parts of Ukraine's bridgeheads that they have established since summer of this year. So for instance, you have a lot of these units, or at least a lot of the elements of these units that are being moved across the bridgehead adjacent to the Antonovsky Bridge and adjacent to the village of Dachi, where you do have a sizable Ukrainian force from previous landings and previous rotations starting in the summer. And since then, they have been able to hold onto their positions. And recently, over the past few weeks, they've been strengthening their positions over here. Looking a bit to the east, you also have Ukrainian forces trying to reinforce their positions around the Antonovsky rail bridge. You're not seeing any sort of major expansion attempts by the Ukrainians, but you are seeing them starting to send in some men going further east in this direction where I have the arrow pointed. So they're trying to establish positions in the houses, in the rural dachas that are adjacent to the Dnieper River. So just as an example, you have Ukrainian forces taking up positions in these houses over here, and even in these houses over here. So that's a pretty sizable amount of houses where you do have Ukrainian forces active in right now. And then the separation between the Russian and Ukrainian forces would be that the Ukrainians are located in these houses and the Russians are dug in their defenses around Pryyutne and some of the fortifications adjacent to this road that I'm going over in red. And then the gray zone is the floodplains. So here, for instance, we have this video which confirms the Ukrainian movement in this area. You could see the geolocation, you could see that the rivers in the background, and you could see the Russian shelling of the Ukrainian forces as they are moving around this area, trying to establish positions, perhaps conducting some localized raids, which we're going to get to in a second, but I'll just show you guys an extra piece of footage from that shelling at the end of the video over here. So you could see that the Russians are responding with their own airstrikes and artillery in anticipation of the Ukrainian movements. The Ukrainians, per Russian sources, are attacking in the direction of Pryyutne, but these are DRG attacks, so they're raids that are not meant to be a permanent conquest of territory. So these DRG raids are going in the direction of Pryyutne, and not really as much in Poima, a little bit in Pryyutne, but mainly Pryyutne. There's a video that I won't show, but it's geolocated on my map, which shows a Russian drone which drops munitions onto the Ukrainian DRGs. And several Ukrainian DRGs were killed and wounded by this attack. You could see that the Ukrainians took this specific road, and they probably started off with the route that I showed on the rail corridor, and they took the same road all the way to here. And then you could see how the goal would be to advance either to the north or to the south. And this local road does present multiple different opportunities for Ukrainian DRGs to go deeper into Russian positions, including to the Pryyutne to try to flank it from the northeast, but also to flank Kosachi Lahari from the west, which is again a part of Ukraine's broader plans in this region. And then also, if we're talking about broader plans, not saying this is going to happen, but in terms of what Ukraine's looking for, their goals, that includes trying to conduct DRG raids that try to disrupt Russian supply lines, including highways that are going from Radensk to Oleshki or from Radensk to Kosachi Lahari. Now, the Ukrainian forces, including the Birds of Magyar drone units, they're now beginning to send in additional FPV drones and other drones to conduct attacks onto Russian equipment that's being moved to the front line. We've talked about this before. I'm just showing another video, or actually photos of a before and after. Here you can see a Russian KAMAZ truck. It gets struck by an FPV from the Birds of Magyar unit. So here you can see the after effects of that in this image. And as we talked about before, the Russians are also responding in kind, but they're not just using their own FPV strikes or their own drones dropping munitions, as we talked about in the previous geolocation that we showed. But there's also Russian artillery strikes ongoing on the multiple different bridgeheads. There's some pretty heavy bombardment also on the northern bank of the Dnieper River, so located specifically around here, around the village of Sadove. And the reason why is because a lot of the Ukrainian Marines and DRGs, etc., that are being moved via speedboats across the river, they begin their congregation around here in these different houses before they cross over. So preemptively, the Russians are trying to strike this area. And around Krinky, the situation is very interesting because now the Russian sources are again reporting that there were efforts to dislodge the Ukrainian forces from their positions within the village. No updates on whether they were successful. For now, it appears that the Ukrainians are holding on to the defenses over here. The Russians have moved in additional units per their own sources mentioning the movement of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. I think this is very interesting because in my previous video was talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We talked about how this specific unit was originally stationed along the Kherson front but was moved to the Orkiv sector to help defend against the Ukrainian attacks. If it is true that this unit was moved back to this area, then it would show that the Russians are willing to move their reinforcements that they moved to the south to this sector over here to hold back and actually conduct counterattacks back to take the Ukrainian positions on the southern bank of the Dnieper River. So we're going to have to see if this unit is able to help the newly formed 26th Motor Rifle Regiment, which has way less experience than, for instance, this Naval Infantry Brigade. It's a newly formed unit. So we're going to have to see if they're able to dislodge the Ukrainian forces in the future. Now, moving on to the Orkiv sector, we're going to focus on the area just to the west of Robotyne because in this area, starting around the 23rd of October, there were reports that came out from the Ukrainian side mentioning a renewal of Ukrainian offensive activity in the area in between Kopani and Robotyne. And there was mention of Ukrainians utilizing tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in the fields just to the west of Robotyne in an effort to advance further south. Now, the reason why I think this happened, I think there is several different reasons for why that I could think of. First of all, the Ukrainians, they want to reduce the pressure onto their forward positions located on this hill to the south of Robotyne, where there are trench fortifications that the Ukrainians hold, but that have been assaulted and attacked by the Russians on their western flank. So located over here, you've had numerous Russian attacks on the Ukrainian forward positions in these trenches. And when you have these constant Russian attacks, it makes it hard for Ukrainian forces to congregate over here and conduct attacks further south into Novoprokopivka. So I think by attacking from the west of Robotyne, I think that the Ukrainians were trying to dislodge the Russian forward elements in this region. Additionally, on a more wider level, we can talk about how the Ukrainians for multiple weeks now have tried to dislodge the Russian forces from their forward positions in the fields and trenches to the east of Kopani. So a lot of those efforts were centered around this area over here. But this entire Ukrainian operation, I believe, is a part of a wider plan to try to degrade the Russian forces over here and gradually take over the trench positions, because the Russian trenches and the fields to the east of Kopani are located on higher elevation, overlooking a lot of the Ukrainian positions in Robotyne and a lot of the supply lines leading into there. So they want to reduce pressure onto the village of Robotyne, and they also want to expand the vectors of attack onto Novoprokopivka. So this Ukrainian assault was most likely conducted by Ukraine's 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which is still located in this area and is fighting on the front lines. Now, what we saw as a result of these attacks were several videos released by the Beaver drone unit, which is a Russian UAV unit that released videos showing strikes on 3 different Leopard tanks. And this is just one of them. This is a video showing their FPV striking a Leopard 2A6 to the area just to the west of Robotyne as it was advancing in this area that I show over here in the gray zone. And you can see the destruction. There are multiple different videos showing destruction. There's 2 videos of Leopard 2A4s being targeted, and there's one of the 2A6, the one that I'm showing you here. There's also another video showing a YPR 765 infantry fighting vehicle being targeted by the Beaver drone units. And there's another one showing a RPG, a Russian RPG, hitting what was claimed to be a Leopard tank and destroying it. But I really can't tell from that video specifically if it was actually a Leopard. Either way, it was a Ukrainian vehicle. So for now, whatever Ukrainian assaults were launched over here, which admittedly they are smaller in scale than other Ukrainian attacks that have been launched throughout the course of this counteroffensive. This seems like a much more localized attack aimed at like a more local goal. But either way, it does show that at least in relative terms, the Ukrainians have increased their assaults on this one specific part of the Orkiv sector, because previously we weren't even seeing any sort of mechanized assaults in this region for multiple different weeks. Now, moving to the Velika Novosilka sector, we're going to look at what's going on around Pryyutne, because for multiple weeks now, the Russians have been launching localized attacks, again, very small, because look at the front line around Pryyutne. It's just like 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers at most when you measure it. So this is a pretty small area, but the Russians, nonetheless, they've been trying to relieve pressure off of the village of Pryyutne, as I see it as a forward operating base for their forces in the region to conduct attacks even further north and try to take over Ukrainian positions near the ponds and near the open fields and tree lines in the region. So what we saw in videos from, I believe it was 1 or 2 days ago, was a Russian attack with several different tanks and armored fighting vehicles advancing along these different paths. For instance, there's this local road over here through which the Russians advanced. There's also these different tree lines and the local paths adjacent to them. So you had the Russian vehicles advancing through there, and they engaged with the Ukrainian positions, including with Ukrainian armor located within this specific forested area, which has lost a lot of foliage per the footage in the area. So, this is generally where you had that engagement. So this gives us an idea of where the gray zone is located. And it gives us an idea of the fact that the Russians do have more of the initiative in this area. But again, it's not like any sort of plan for a major offensive operation. What I do find interesting, though, is that previously the Ukrainians, they were making plans following their capture of Pryyutne and Avdiivka to storm Pryyutne, which would be able to give them the momentum to advance even further south. But the Russians were able to fortify their positions around Pryyutne, and now they're the ones conducting localized counterattacks. The Ukrainians, they moved out of the 31st Mechanized Brigade from the general area to the north of Pryyutne, and they moved it to the Avdiivka sector. 31st Brigade is one of the newly formed units from 2023 that was meant to be used for the counteroffensive, but now it's being moved to help defend against the Russian attacks on the northern flank of Avdiivka. And this is a common theme for a lot of different units around the Velika Novosilka sector that I will be showing you guys in a second. And this just goes to show that in terms of the Ukrainian priority list, they care more about holding back and causing damage to the Russian attacks than conducting their own attacks specifically on this sector in Velika Novosilka. Now, looking at the Avdiivka sector, we have to go through several days of updates from this region because I was waiting for additional footage to confirm some of the reports that were coming out. And now we also have some reports coming out from the pro-Ukrainian side mentioning some change to the front line. So we're going to look through all of that. We're going to begin by looking at the south. And what I'll say more generally is that there have been pretty significant Russian assaults starting a couple of days ago. And specifically on the 25th, there was also another Russian attack that started early in the morning around 4 a.m. And these attacks were preceded by a lot of fire from the Russian barrel artillery and MLRS. And there was also some aerial bombardment reported in the direction of Pryyutne and generally on a lot of the villages just to the west of Avdiivka that are feeding into the village. One of the more significant ones I saw mentioned is Robotyne. This is a village, it makes sense why it would be targeted because it seems like one of the supply hubs that a lot of equipment goes through before making its way to the front line. And so you had targeting of that. But in terms of changes around Pryyutne, there were none that I could find. There was a minor Russian advance reported by Deep State Map around Robotyne. This is the full extent of that Russian advance. You can measure it in meters. Let's see, it's like a couple hundred meters, you could say. And then if we look a bit to the east, there were also Russian attacks reported just to the west of Severonoye, but there's no information about any sort of Russian advance here just yet. So we're going to have to wait and see about what happens over there. Nothing really from the south of Avdiivka. The main events occurred on Avdiivka's northern flank specifically. So we're going to look through this in more detail now. So looking at Avdiivka's northern flank, the Russians, one of their main objectives with launching these attacks was to take over the Terrakon slag heap located over here. So here on the elevation map, you'll understand why. The Terrakon slag heap, it is one of the highest points in the entire region. Look at the elevation juxtaposed to, for instance, certain positions within Avdiivka itself that would be overlooked by the positions on the slag heap. Look at some of the fields that are to the northeast of Avdiivka. Look at parts of the coke plant. To be fair though, a lot of the coke plant is on similar elevation. For instance, the highest floors of some of the structures within the coke plant, because the coke plant is not just a single area. There are multiple different buildings over there, and some of them are actually pretty high and give you a very good line of sight that is on par with the slag heap in certain areas. But if we look further west, for instance, at Avdiivka or some of these other different villages that lead into Avdiivka where a lot of the supplies pass through, again, in comparison to the slag heap, they're on pretty low elevation. And same thing goes for the fields where a lot of the battles are ongoing in right now. They are overlooked by the slag heap. Over the past 4 days, Ukrainian sources such as Deep State reported Russian advances towards the Terrakon slag heap. And by the 24th of October, Russian sources themselves began claiming that they were able to advance in the direction of the slag heap, They did admit that they were not in full control of the slag heap and that there was still a process of fully taking it over in a physical manner, not just in terms of like fire control, but that the Ukrainians did fully withdraw after very, very fierce resistance. And we actually have village videos that were released from Russia today, drone footage showing that Russian drones, artillery strikes, and also LMUR air-to-surface missiles from helicopters were launched at Ukrainian forces that were located at the top of the slag heap, and that is part of what prompted the Ukrainians to eventually withdraw after being able to hold on to the slag heap for about 2 weeks of heavy Russian assaults in that direction. So I can't show the footage of the Russians striking the Ukrainian forces over here, but I will describe, for instance, that some of these strikes targeted dugouts and tunnel systems that are within the slag heap. So it seems like the Ukrainians were prepared for this for a pretty long time, and they were able to seek cover in those areas whenever the Russians would launch attacks, but sometimes that would not be enough. For instance, in this case, you had the LMUR missile from the helicopter that targeted specifically one of these dugouts in this region. And then if we go to the next photo, you'll see over here that the Russians eventually, once the Ukrainians left the region, they sent perhaps a group of forces to raise this flag of, first of all, the Russian flag, but also the flag of the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade, which is a unit located over here. It's a part of the DPR's 1st Army Corps. And so that flag was raised and was supposed to be used as like proof that the Russians were able to take over the area. But the Russians, even now after all this time, because this incident happened a couple of days ago, they are not physically sending in a large group of forces into this area, and that makes complete sense because even when the Ukrainians had a rather small force on the slag heap, they were taking losses due to the Russians being able to see their positions and being able to strike them even when they were in the dugouts. So I would assume that even if the Russians have been able to clear out the Ukrainian resistance in this region, they would not want to send in a large force over here, perhaps just some small groups into the dugouts to perhaps take it over and then use it for short periods of time as observation posts or just to fire more generally onto the Ukrainian positions within the coke plant itself. But if we're going to look back at the incident regarding the flag, here we have a Ukrainian FPV. It tries to hit the flag again. And the reason I'm showing this is just so you guys get an idea of how the slag heap looks like from a closer perspective. And it seems like after the FPV strike, the flag stick actually stays standing, but the flag actually did suffer some damage. But again, this gives you guys an idea of how the slag heap itself looks like from a closer area. In all likelihood, though, the Russians do have some positions that are on the downward side of the slag heap facing in the direction of the Russian-controlled areas. So that would mean like the areas over here, those are most likely Russian positions. But another issue that is important to bring up in terms of the slag heap is that soldiers staying over here, they could suffer from dust and glass inhalation. And that could be further compounded by the fact that if there's an artillery strike nearby where the soldiers are located, that could shatter the glass and it would throw a lot of it into the air, and that could just make the inhalation even worse. So that also raises questions about how long these soldiers could even be stationed on the slag heap in general. But again, it is a part of Russia's broader plan of trying to take over key points in the hopes of eventually securing the coke plant, which would be a major fortification, including all the tunnels inside. The coke plant itself is 4 square kilometers, so it is a massive area with multiple different structures, with many different Ukrainian forces over here. It could be in hundreds or even more at this point with the amount of reinforcements that are being moved into the region. And they do also have stockpiles of weapons in all these basements located over here. So you could imagine how difficult of a task it is. So the Russians really are trying to find every way they can to gain an advantage against the Ukrainian forces over here, which does include a very heavy bombardment of the Ukrainian positions within the coke plant right now. Deep State, they mentioned the movement of additional Russian reserves in order to help continue their assaults on the front line in the direction of the rail line and of the village of Stepove. And additionally, they mentioned that the Russians are moving away from large armored columns of assaults, and they're now trying to prefer the use of infantry tactics. So they're sending in more groups of infantry to overrun Ukrainian positions. This is according to Deep State. And what Deep State says that this is in spite of heavy casualties. That's what the pro-Ukrainian source is alleging. They also claim that the Russians were able to reach the approaches of the rail line, but that they have not been able to physically cross it yet. So that would mean that the front line is generally around this area, and that the Russians were able to capture some of Ukraine's forward line of defense. So, for instance, the Ukrainians, when they dug in this region, they had trenches in different defensive positions built up in the tree lines that are just to the west of Krasnohorivka by about 1 kilometer. So those positions specifically were overrun by the Russians over the course of the past few days. And then the next layer of Ukrainian defenses would be along this rail line, which is now the new Russian objective in this region. And the Ukrainians, they are trying to hold back the Russians over here, launching their own localized counterattack. So here we could see a video. I won't show it, but there's a link over here. Drones from the Platov unit, which is another drone unit that's active across the entire front line. They were able to destroy 2 Ukrainian tanks that were crossing over in this region, which also does confirm that the front line is generally close to this area, in that this area specifically where the geolocated marker is a gray zone just to the east of the rail line. Due to the pressure that Russia is applying on the northern flank of Avdiivka, the Ukrainians, they understand the state of the situation and understand the significance of holding on to Avdiivka for as long as possible. So as a result, they moved in the 47th Mechanized Brigade. This is a unit that we've talked about ad nauseum on the Orikhiv sector. It's been involved in frontline activities for months now. Throughout the summer, they were involved in taking over Robotyne and then launching attacks on the fields to the south of it, to the east of it. So yeah, they have been at the forefront of fighting for a very long time. Over the past few weeks, I will say that I have noticed less of them. So it is possible that in that time they were trying to be given some rest on the rear. It is certainly possible. About 2 weeks ago, I was talking about how they were being rotated out in favor of the 65th Mechanized Brigade. And now it seems like, even though they had this like brief honeymoon period, you could say, and even then there were still some elements of this brigade that were fighting on the front line up until a couple of days ago around the Orikhiv sector. Even now, they are being moved to an even hotter part of the front line where the fighting is even more intense around the Avdiivka front. And this is very interesting because, first of all, it shows that the Ukrainian priority is, first of all, to defend Avdiivka and not to conduct mechanized assaults across the Orikhiv sector. Obviously, we talked earlier in the video about how they were doing that, but the fact that they're moving in one of the units that was slated for those attacks and has been doing them for many months is very, very telling. Another thing that's very interesting is that this unit was moved in and it wasn't really given that much time to rest in between. So it would show that the Ukrainians are very keen on moving in as many defenses as they can to this region to help stabilize the line and help inflict further losses onto the Russians. So we do have confirmation of the 42nd Brigade being, or 47th Brigade being involved in the fighting. We'll show a video of 2 M2A2 Bradleys, and most of the Bradleys were given to the 47th Brigade. Here we could see in this video that 2 Bradleys are giving fire support to Ukrainian forces that are dug in this trench located over here. So it's located in the fields to the west of Krasnohorivka, and they're giving fire support to them as Russians send waves of infantry and also some of their columns, their armored columns, to try to overrun this specific trench. And that's a part of the Russian entire process of trying to reach the rail line. So the Ukrainian forces over here, they fought off those attacks for a while, but eventually they were forced to evacuate. So they did that under the cover of the fire support from these 2 Bradleys, which again indicates that there is fighting not just going on in the western direction of Krasnohorivka, but also in the northern direction over here. And then even further north, also along the same rail line, we have this video from the artillery group of the 1st Tank Brigade showing that they hit a Russian column that was able to cross over the rail line in this specific area over here, and they are able to destroy one of the tanks or perhaps one of the vehicles that was involved in this assault. And the thing that's very interesting about this is that the 1st Tank Brigade, that's a unit that was also around the Velika Novosilka sector. They were around there for a couple of months, and now they've been moved in to help reinforce the line around Avdiivka. They're not the only unit that's involved from the Velika Novosilka sector to the Avdiivka front. You have 129th Territorial Defense Brigade that was moved in a couple of weeks ago. You have the separate Presidential Brigade that was moved in recently. So yeah, you do have a lot of reinforcements, not to mention 31st that we talked about before. And looking back at Krasnohorivka's northern positions, just to the north of it, it makes sense that the Russians are trying to attack over here because previously there was Ukrainian pressure along the rail line to the north of Krasnohorivka because the Ukrainians, they want to disrupt the Russian organization in Krasnohorivka. A lot of the infantry and a lot of the vehicles that assault Avdiivka's northern flank, they start in Krasnohorivka, and that's their organizing points. So by disrupting that cohesion from the north, they would be able to prevent those attacks from even starting. And that's why the Russians are trying to improve their positions along the rail line just to the north of the village. And that does mean that perhaps there will be some additional fighting in the fields located over here within this red box, and perhaps even closer to the direction of Novokalinove. But this is also an area where Ukrainians have moved in reinforcements. So you could see how the front line will begin to expand, and there will be heavy fighting in this region as well. And so yeah, that's all for today. Video is pretty long, but we're gonna go over the Bakhmut sector in a different video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in a later video. Thank you guys. Bye.